Maybe I will start with Juliane. Can you tell me what is your interest in carbon pricing and how do we get there? It doesn't have to be a carbon tax. There are multiple ways to get there. So give us a little bit of your perspective on the topic.
Absolutely. So thank you for the invitation to be here today. I think carbon pricing is absolutely essential, right? If we're looking at having a business impact and making sure that we look at the cost of carbon. And there's different ways to look at that, right? We're looking at compliance markets, we'll look at internal carbon pricing, and we're looking at the voluntary carbon market as well. And when I look at the voluntary carbon market specifically, I think that one is really interesting because you've got the different forces of demand and supply. So what you've got is a whole range of different carbon credits and ways to price up carbon, but also you're looking at the supply, right, and what's available out there and different ways to kind of look at differentiating that. And if you compare that to the compliance market, I mean, that's a very different way of looking at carbon pricing and the way that that is regulated.
Do you see a part of the world that's advancing more rapidly in this area?
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting, right? So when you're looking at different ways that different projects are priced, specifically in the voluntary sector, you've got different, again, ways of looking at pricing carbon credits. So looking at projects that are having delivered specific co-benefits, you're looking at projects that are delivering certain benefits when it comes to project types, etc. So I think it's an interesting angle. Yeah.
You mentioned the voluntary carbon markets. Stuart, I know you think about this quite a lot. How do you see the state of voluntary carbon markets? There have obviously been lots of troubles in the nature-based credits markets.
Yeah.
We're going to see, at the same time, both an interaction between those voluntary markets, and now that we have lots of compliance markets, certainly in Europe, California, we have Singapore, perhaps could be included in that mix. So there seems to be something of a dichotomy.
Yeah.
Do you see some sort of convergence coming, or do you see the bottom falling out on the nature-based markets? What do you predict, and what do your on the ground truths reveal?
That's quite a big question. I'll try and tackle it in bits. I think it's always important to remember that the voluntary carbon market is a relatively small piece of the picture. So last year, I think there were something like 185 million tons of retirements of carbon credits in the voluntary market, which is less than 0.4% of global emissions. So it's tiny. We're not going to offset our way out of this situation. So I think you have to therefore look at the spectrum of activity that's required.
Yeah.
We really, really need to focus on the reductions, and we as players in this market will always tell people to focus on reducing first and offsetting or doing other kind of removals later. But I think the voluntary carbon market, although small in terms of significance in the overall piece, has a very, very important role to play. And I think it's partly because of the history of the market. And as you say, there have been troubles, there have been headwinds, there have been controversies. But there is 15, 20 years of good practice in the voluntary carbon market. And we've seen a lot of advancements in the last few years in terms of standards and due diligence and the quality of credits, the integrity of credits, the transparency of credits. And I think that has a role to play in the overall carbon pricing and the regulatory and voluntary market. So
have we turned the corner on those, though? Because we still see challenges, and we'll have someone from South Pole speaking a bit later. We'll hear more, from the coalface, as it were. But we saw Jeff Bezos and the troubles at SBTI. We've seen ongoing sort of challenges and controversies. Last Climate Week, Bill Gates was asked about nature-based markets, and his answer was, "Are we the science people or are we the idiots?" Alluding to the lack of permanence of nature-based markets, or at least some of the challenges about proving the durability of those credits compared to, let's say, those that are mineralization or the more engineered credits. Have we turned the corner on these? And I welcome anyone on the panel to comment on this.
I'll sort of hand to Rob in a second, but I think we have turned the corner. I think that the scrutiny and integrity in the voluntary carbon market now means that the quality and assurance and reliability of supply is there. It has pushed the market to focus more on certain credits. So we're seeing much more interest in direct air capture and other engineered solutions. From a pure science perspective, that's not necessarily the right way to go. But I think from an overall tackling climate change and mandatory and voluntary compliance perspective, that is a good thing because it is stimulating new technologies, allowing new technologies to get to scale, so that as people become more comfortable with the idea of offsetting and our need for offsetting increases, we will have those technologies to buy on at scale. They're all pretty nascent at the moment.
What do you think, Rob?
I agree with Stuart, but I also think that there's we've set up accidentally a competition between different activities, which we need to be doing all of, essentially. And it comes back to the size of the voluntary market and the pot available for voluntary action. Our corporate clients, they want to do what is considered best practice, and they want to get business value from what they're doing. And they've been pushed in the direction of investing in these longer term durable removals, which is absolutely essential.
Yeah.
But it's at the cost of doing shorter term forest protection, for example. And we've set up a system or by accident whereby we are diverting money from forest protection into early stage technologies. Not doing both, we're diverting from one to the other. And that's, nobody wants that to happen.
But I guess in some ways the framework is one of lack of trust. That's the reason this is happening, right? A tremendous amount of trust is and goodwill has gone from this area. One of the solutions that's proposed, of course, regulation would be one way. The regulated markets the compliance markets provide integrity. The alternative that has been proposed is technology. There's a tremendous advance in satellite technology, drones, Internet of Things, communications. Ultimately, the Internet of Trees. The picture behind you could have a sensor in every tree telling you what the carbon content is and if it burns down, etc. That's one solution that's proposed. Others try using financial innovation, right? I think, is it TPG Rise that has an arm that tries to do a portfolio approach, almost as they claim it's something like an ETF of these projects that over time they will manage the risks. If some projects fall off the map because of deforestation or some other reason, they'll swap in equivalent credits and you just worry about the bundle that is managing risk through portfolio, so that they make it simpler for their ultimate consumers. What do you think about these ideas of using different kinds of innovation to overcome the trust barrier? Given that we're dealing with something in the last 30 years, we haven't figured out how to do a global, meaningful, harmonized carbon price or carbon regulation. We've had multiple cycles of rise and fall of these sorts of efforts. Do we have some tools now that we didn't have 20 years ago with China and CDM and so on?
Shall I?
Sure, whoever wants to jump in.
So firstly, I think there's been a huge amount of work done over the last couple of years to try to regain that trust, and particularly through the independent bodies of the ICVCM and the VCMI on carbon credit quality and on the claims that companies can make. We're seeing actually our clients feeling more comfortable in following those frameworks. So we're hopeful that a lot of that trust that's been lost can be regained by these frameworks if they're well adopted. I think the next stage actually is to rebuild the business case. What business value are companies getting from participating in voluntary climate action? Because that's the second phase of after regaining trust is to rebuild that business case. I think very quickly on the technology, etc. It's really brought monitoring on leaps and bounds, but it is expensive, and therefore, it does make some projects unviable, and therefore, in those cases, often a lot of community benefits are lost as a result. So there's a balance to be struck as well.
But the cost of technologies are falling rapidly, right? So we must come to a point where it becomes cost effective, or we're not. Your point is we're not there yet.
Yeah, but in the case of cooking, for example, we're putting an IoT device in every in every cooking device that costs $10, and that's how much the family can afford. Adding another $2 or $3 per unit into that does make a difference.
Yeah, fair point.
It also only gets you to some of the issues. So some of the challenges in the carbon markets have been around the growth of trees, permanence of trees, comparisons of the control areas of trees and the trees protected under schemes. That you can remotely sense, you can use technology to address. A lot of the other issues have been around human rights, the due diligence around land ownership and those sorts of things, which are all about the quality of the standard and the due diligence prior to the inception of the project. And your technology isn't really going to help you address that. You've got to do the work on the ground to fix that so it's not a problem in the first place. Part of that is because of the way that the carbon mechanisms work. Typically projects are in developing countries. They have to be because of the way the system is set up. Where I think carbon pricing and regulation can help, if we take France as an example, if you look at Article 147 in France, that now basically says if you are a domestic airline, you either can't fly or you have to offset your domestic flight emissions. And that's stimulating really good quality forestry projects in France on the ground that you can have very clear understanding of land ownership rights. You can monitor either directly by going to site and measuring, you can remote sense as well. So I think, if we assume that we need every tool in the toolbox to fight climate change, we need to improve the voluntary carbon markets in the more remote places. We need to stimulate local development, local markets using regulatory mechanisms. We need to do everything.
So we've talked a lot about the voluntary carbon markets and that particular mechanism of trading. What about getting to some kind of carbon pricing, the topic of our session, through the back door in a way that is with a big stick? Europe is implementing the CBAM. Everyone in this room will know the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And this is already having ripple effects around the world. Yeah. It is very controversial, as you would know, in developing countries, some of whom are promising to fight it legally and otherwise. But from reporting on the ground, companies in South Africa, India, Indonesia, even China are already making arrangements, some of them, including some big Indian conglomerates that have exports to Europe, to acquire renewable energy, for example, to show that they're greening the portion of their steel they intend to ship to Europe and so on, in order to avoid a hefty penalty of the CBAM at the border. So I'm curious, when we think about this, could this be the way that some meaningful carbon price comes to the developing world? Or is this likely to fail? Is this going to go the way that GDPR, which has been cut and pasted by many parts of the world? Or is it less likely to be as successful as that? I'm curious what people think.
CBAM in some degree is a response to the relatively slow progress of EU ETS as a European compliance scheme. So the first couple of phases of that delivered some benefit in terms of reducing emissions, particularly in the energy sector and coal-related emissions. But it didn't necessarily decarbonize to the extent that was perhaps anticipated to start with. And that was a lot to do with the allocation of allowances and,
exemptions.
Exemptions because of the
political
possibility of carbon leakage. So CBAM addresses that by externalizing that cost and effectively putting the tariff on carbon. I think that's a good model. I think that different countries will respond in different ways, but we have seen positive responses because of CBAM's sort of derogation, where you have a carbon pricing mechanism in the country of origin. We are seeing countries set that up. We are seeing that as a mechanism for driving carbon pricing and carbon mechanisms in other countries. So, I think that that's another useful tool. Yeah.
Does anyone have a different view on CBAM?
I hope it works in the spirit of most of us wanting to see a global compliance, good cost on carbon. The last time that the EU tried to impose pricing outside of its borders with the EU ETS and aviation back in 2012, it didn't go so well. There was a lot of pushback, and they had to retreat back to the borders. So, yeah, I don't know whether it will work, but I think it's a really good response to the problem that we currently have of leakage. We've got 25% of global emissions covered under compliance. It's been successful in those regions that it's been implemented, but quite a lot of that success has been through the export.
What's going to happen when one of the world's biggest carbon polluters, one that has no meaningful federal carbon tax, is slapped with CBAM duties? And of course, I'm talking not about China here, which has domestic carbon prices for a number of its industries, but the United States, where the only legally enforced federal price on any kind of greenhouse gas, which was the methane fee, which came in with the IRA law, has just been repealed by the GOP. And so there is no meaningful federal restriction on or carbon price or equivalent greenhouse gas price. How will that go over, and how is that going to work out in your estimation?
Sounds like a tariff.
Julia, it's your turn.
Everybody's favorite word, tariff. I think if you're the US economy, you get the right to negotiate, don't you? You don't get slapped with that. You get a seat at the table and you have the conversation. So I'm not sure that it has the action you want going in that direction across the Atlantic.
So how would this work? So exports from US steel would face no CBAM surcharge, but those from China steel would, or Tata Steel?
That sounds perfect for Mr. Trump, doesn't it? I mean, isn't that what he wants?
Oh, no, I'm sure that's what America wants, but would that fly in Brussels is the question.
Well, I don't know.
Don't know. Okay, so we have to see.
Absolutely.
Yet to come on this.
Yeah.
We're likely to face the same issue with Corsia.
Yeah. Tell us what's the future for Corsia?
I think it depends on what the United States attitude to Corsia is for the next phase, for the first phase.
It's fair to say under Trump, it's unlikely to proceed very enthusiastically.
It would be surprising if it did.
Right.
And then if it did, we'll have to wait and see how everybody else responds, how the EU thinks about EU ETS, continuing EU ETS, how some of the other big economies respond to whether they want to participate in Corsia or not.
What is the role of internal carbon pricing at companies? This was quite the fashion a few years ago, and you don't hear much about it anymore. Is it because it was mostly sort of greenwashing exercises, or do any of you have any strong feelings about why they might be pretty good to do?
I think we saw it become fashionable a number of years ago, particularly in those businesses where it was relatively easy to do. Set a price and apply a price.
What's an example of an industry where it's easy to do?
Oh, that's a good question. Not an individual industry, but typically proportions of businesses have it applied. So you can easily apply it to investment cases. You build a carbon price into your energy efficiency investment business case. If you're looking at,
right.
Improving the efficiency of factories, quite often you will see carbon prices applied to travel-related emissions to, have an influence on the amount of business travel that's done. What we're tending to see now is that as organizations are on their decarbonisation journey and their pathway, as they tackle the low-hanging fruit, you need to start to pull greater numbers of levers to achieve the hard-to-abate stuff. So where organizations, kind of pathway, science-based target pathway and their emissions are diverging, we're starting to see the sort of resurgence of carbon pricing, internal carbon pricing as a way to drive the behaviors across the business. And that can be in business travel, it can be in investment cases around energy efficiency, it can be used as a way to assess whether offsetting is the right thing to do. Is it cheaper to buy offsets? Is it cheaper to invest in carbon reduction? So we as a business are definitely seeing an uptick in that as an action lever.
And does it work? I guess is the other question. In terms of producing results, it does.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, lots and lots of people I talk to, particularly those in the engineering parts of businesses where they are factoring in carbon into their investment decisions around these energy conservation measures that they're trying to put in place, they are seeing it bring down the payback period for an investment very, very significantly, and that will allow them to get the go-ahead from the board to make the investment, get the capex investment. It can shift the needle from a 5 or 6 year payback, which for the majority of large corporates is too long, down to the sort of 3 year window, which is typically what is more acceptable.
Okay, well, that's a more positive story than I'd expected. So that's good to hear. Let's see if we can get a question from the audience. I see a quick hand here. Let's get a microphone to the gentleman. And maybe I think one behind afterward.
Hello, I'm David Pollock of Consilium Capital. I wonder whether you think the Australia carbon credit market is a model for other countries to follow, whereby they actually have a regulator, the clean energy regulator, who approves the registration of projects under different methodologies, forestry, soil carbon, etc. And they then qualify for Australian carbon credit units, for which there's demand through the safeguard mechanism from the high emitters.
Any takers?
I'm not that familiar with the Australian market, I have to say.
Me neither. I think what I would say is that
they should invest in a better PR man, clearly. Should be advice back to your regulator.
Yeah, absolutely.
None of my experts have heard of them or know much about them.
I think, we have enough mechanisms. We're not lacking in mechanisms in quality standards and third-party audit, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not sure that an overarching regulatory body at a global level would deliver the value that it would cost, potentially.
To ask your corporates, would they have more trust in projects that are approved by a regulator than one through various voluntary frameworks? I'd be interested in their answer.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's a good intervention. There's a lady behind you who had a question. We'll get the microphone to you 1 second.
Hi, thank you. My name is Océane Devigne. I work at Asha Horizon, and I agree completely that we need to focus on reductions, and that's the priority. But why would you advise companies to procrastinate on carbon removals? Maybe to give a little bit of context, if we're trying to get to that 10 gigatons of carbon removals by 2050, I think that number was given by the IPCC. If another piece of context is if we were to install like a 1 million facility capability each week over the next 25 years, we would only arrive at 1.3 billion of removals a year. So if we're just procrastinating, how are we going to be scaling that up?
I think it's an interesting question, right? Because if we look at the voluntary market, the total available volume for removal only makes up about 1% of that market, right? And we're already seeing a lot of organizations purchasing credits that have future vintages. So there isn't that much volume out there. And we're seeing different kind of price dynamics play into that as well, right? We're seeing on the technology side, prices are coming down, right? So again, huge variance in terms of the total amount of prices when you look at biochar, right, ranging between sort of $100 to $300 per ton. And then you're looking at direct air capture, right, very different between sort of $600 to $1,200. But all of these prices is what we're seeing are coming down, right? But when you're looking at nature-based removals, again, we're not expecting a huge amount of change there. Prices are relatively high and are expected to continue to be high. So I think companies need to take action now, actually, and look at removal options.
Yeah, I don't think we're advising anyone to procrastinate on investing in removals, and particularly durable ones. My point earlier was that it shouldn't be at the expense of doing everything else, and that's the dynamic that we've got ourselves into. We need those durable removals at volume in 30 years' time. But if we haven't financed tropical rainforest protection for the next 20 years as a result of investing in removals, then we're going to need even more removals and we'll lose so much else.
Yeah.
And that's the paradox that we find ourselves in, and I think our corporate clients do too.
Well, we're out of time, but I think you kind of wrapped up the paradox nicely. I think this is a very powerful lever. There would be no more powerful lever for action on climate than having a global, transparent carbon price that's harmonized over time to acknowledge the externality of carbon, of greenhouse gases. We know that that ideal or utopian dream is not to be realized. It will be a messy journey in different parts of the world in different ways, in different sectors, even within companies. We've heard some examples, and with voluntary markets, with mandatory or compliance markets connected again in a messy way. But in a sense, that's a microcosm of the energy transition more broadly, and the sustainability effort more broadly. That the ideal of how things should be done is not how it's going to be. So it's time to roll up our sleeves and get on with the job. So for giving us a dose of reality, thanks to our experts.
Thank you.
Please give them a nice round of applause.